More than 1,300 people experiencing poverty and social exclusion, gathering with them at the Vatican Paul VI Hall for a festive meal marking the World Day of the Poor. The hall was transformed into a vast dining room for the occasion. The event was organized by the Congregation of the Mission on behalf of the Vincentian missionaries worldwide, who this year celebrate the 400th anniversary of the founding of their congregation and of the Daughters of Charity. In a special effort to highlight dignity and respect, the Vatican provided full table service with proper dishes, flatware, and table linens, avoiding plastic or disposable materials. Organizers saying the aim was not only to offer a meal, but to create an experience of welcome and care for each guest. For more news with a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping? Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion on this Monday afternoon. Glad to have you with us. This program is for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, we can get that question answered in this hour. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response, and then once you get that response, text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And of course, you can always send us an email. ctc@ewtn.com is the address for that. ctc@ewtn.com. Show team is in place. Ace McKay producing today. Vanessa is handling social media. Matt is on screening. He's going to be the first voice that you hear when you call 833-288-EWTN. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Well, I'm good. How was your weekend?
A bit complicated.
You had a rough morning this morning.
Yeah, I had a family member with an acute appendicitis and an appendectomy, so it was kind of threw us off.
Not something that you have on your Outlook planner, is it?
Definitely not on the Outlook planner.
It's just like, whoop, everything stops.
Everything stops, exactly.
But he's on the upswing.
He's on the upswing.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to lead off with a great email from Lorna. I think this will make you smile, David. Lorna says, did Martin Luther get a few things right at the time of the Reformation?
Yeah, of course he did. Of course he did. Now, here's the thing about Luther. Luther is not when the Reformation begins. There's a Reformation historian named Stephen Osmond who wrote a book called The Age of Reform, subtitle 1250 to 1550.
Okay.
Now, if you know the dates for Luther's Reformation, historians usually date the beginning of Luther's Reformation to 1517.
Yeah.
It's a good bit later than 1250.
Yeah.
And Osmond's point is well taken, that the ideology of reform, that is to say, the sort of collective consciousness that there are things that are amiss in Christendom, that we need to fix them, and even the idea that we need to fix them by hearkening back to an ancient model, to an idealized purity of the so-called early church. All that stuff predates Luther by centuries. In fact, Luther is the heir of that reformist tradition. He's an Augustinian hermit, which was a reforming order that came out of that movement for reform in the late Middle Ages. And so he was far from the only person to point out abuses in the church and problems that needed to be corrected.
Yeah.
Now, on the kind of things that Luther and Catholic reformers would find common cause about, Luther said for him these were not the big issues. In fact, in his response to one Catholic reformer, Erasmus of Rotterdam, Luther wrote in his book Bondage of the Will, he said, the papacy, purgatory, and indulgences. Now, those are the things that many people would associate. These are the kind of like the bedrock issues of the Reformation.
Sure.
Luther says, the papacy, purgatory, and indulgences, these things are mere trifles and not worthy of debate.
Wow.
Now, that kind of upends a lot of people's expectations, right?
Yeah.
For him, for Luther specifically, the bedrock issues were soteriological, that is to say, have to do with the doctrine of salvation, and in particular, Luther's insistence on the doctrine of the bondage of the will, namely that humans do not have free will, and that they cannot cooperate with divine grace in effecting or bringing about their salvation. And that's really central to Luther's view of justification by faith, that there's no moral effort whatsoever at all on the part of the believer that has anything to do with his justification before God. Now, that's, for Luther, whatever else he may have had in common with Catholics, and that is, from my point of view, what he may have gotten right, is inconsequential in his mind compared to the glaring point of difference from Catholics, namely this business about the doctrine of salvation. So, there were lots of people who called out abuses and things that needed to be reformed and fixed in the 16th century. That's not what made Luther distinct. Okay.
And Lorna, thanks so much for your email. Hey, calls are coming in right now, but there's room for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Linda wants to know, how do you know if someone is a male or a female? What determines gender?
Okay. So, first of all, the word gender is a novel word in at least the way it's used in contemporary English, and you don't find it in really in many traditions throughout the world, including the Western tradition. You find the concept of sex. You don't find the concept of gender.
Okay. Gender
is a grammatical concept. For most of Western history, it has to do with the use of language, and its connection to biological sex is tenuous and sometimes arbitrary. One of my favorite examples of this, my friend Father Lambert used to tell me that the Irish word for girl, Colleen, happens to be grammatically masculine.
Really?
Yeah. So, that's just to show you that, masculine and feminine in language, as a grammatical concept, may be connected to gender, to sex on occasion, but sometimes it's disconnected in strange ways. Why are tables feminine in French? I have no idea why tables are feminine in French. It doesn't make any sense to me, But the way modern ideologues use the term gender, I really think it began with Simone de Beauvoir, the existentialist philosopher, who wrote that one is not born, but one becomes a woman. And what she meant by that is that one's biological sex does not impose upon one a solid cultural identity that one has to swallow, right? And he's pushing back against a lot of sexual stereotypes about what women have to do or what they want to do. And so it became kind of a clarion call of the feminist movement to say, well, my biological sex may be one thing, but how I define myself in society and the kind of jobs I can take and how I want to understand myself in relationship to the world, that's something else. Now, de Beauvoir didn't go all the way into gender ideology, but she opened a door there for people to say, oh, well, if my gender, if the way society views me, the way I relate, to society and conceive of myself in the world, if that's something separate from biological sex, now we have the makings of a category called gender. Now let's come back to this after the break.
Yeah, Linda, sit tight there. We'll continue this on the other side. We'll also get to the phones and talk with Bonnie in Massachusetts. Lines are open for you as well. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Monday afternoon here on EWTN. Do stay with us.
If you're looking for 2 solid hours of Catholic news and Catholic newsmakers, catch Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo every weekday morning, 9 Eastern on EWTN Radio Extra.
This is Life Issues with Victor Nieves, president of Life Issues Institute.
Florida Attorney General James Uthmeyer has filed a lawsuit against the abortion giant Planned Parenthood, alleging that they have lied to women about the safety of the chemical abortion pill. The lawsuit reads, quote, Planned Parenthood and its Florida operations mislead women about the critical and undeniable risks of a chemical abortion by deceivingly claiming that these powerful drugs are less risky than everyday pain medication. The lawsuit seeks $350 million in damages, as well as sanctions against Planned Parenthood. Recent insurance data shows the chemical abortion drug is 22 times more dangerous than FDA claims and sends around 1 in 10 women to the emergency room with serious medical complications.
For more information, follow us on social media at Life Issues Institute.
The words of St. Carlo Acutis.
Continuously ask your guardian angel for help. Your guardian angel has to become your best friend.
Discover the world of St. Carlo Acutis today at EWTNRC.com.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on this Monday afternoon here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We have room for your phone call right now. So before the break, we were starting to tackle an email from Linda who says, how do you know if someone is a male or a female? What determines gender?
Yeah, so the first thing I began to do was to sort of try to undermine a little bit part of the premise of the question, which is just to take for granted that there's an ontological category called gender that we have to engage with. And I pointed out that the traditional way of differentiating the human person is by sex, not by this category called gender, which really takes off with Simone de Beauvoir, and then after her morphs into this idea that in addition to your biological sex, you have this other category called gender, which, near as I can tell, in the modern ideology is a kind of an absolute ontological category that's accessible only by intuition and that can be infallibly known, and that has moral priority over the body or any other conception of the human person or any kind of categorization. I think that's a problematic concept. Now, when it comes to the question, how do you determine biological sex? Well, because I'm not sure that, I think the concept of gender, I think, is just fraught with philosophical problems, right? I don't want to assume it. How do you determine biological sex? Well, I think, when you are, I live in Alabama, if you go enroll in the animal science program at Auburn University and you study, the breeding of cattle, I kind of doubt that's ever a problem, right? Usually there's the physical morphology, physical exam indicates certain kind of organs that are present in one sex versus the other. If those are marred or damaged for some reason, simple, DNA test, blood test could probably discern the presence of the XY chromosome, and the rest is history, So, yeah. Usually what we mean by a female is somebody who's capable of bearing children. What we mean by a male is someone who's capable, all things being equal, of engendering children. Notwithstanding that there can be physical problems that can impede that in individual cases, but we're able to recognize this as deficits. Like if I'm born without a right eye, you're not puzzled about whether or not the human person is naturally or sort of intrinsically oriented to having two eyes. Like that exists, and this is a deficit in this one case, right? Yeah. I think the same thing applies to biological sex.
Well, very good. And Linda, thanks so much for your email. We'll get to the phones in about 10 seconds here on EWTN's Call to Communion. A couple lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We talk about the saints a lot here on EWTN. Well, there's a very good reason for that. The saints are the heroes of the Catholic Church, serving as powerful examples for all the faithful. Their lives show us a path to a more spiritual and fulfilling existence, fostering a deeper communion with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. You can discover detailed documentation on the saints recognized as theologians and doctors of the Church. You'll find this resource, and it's a good one, EWTN.com. Look under the Catholicism tab. You'll see saints. It'll just open up a wealth of information just for you. All right, if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning today with Bonnie in Massachusetts, watching us on EWTN television. Hey there, Bonnie. What's on your mind today?
Yes, I'm interested in learning, becoming a convert, but one of the concerns I have is the pedophilia of priests.
Sure. I absolutely appreciate that. So I myself am a convert. I became Catholic in 2003, and if you remember the history, what was it, the Boston Globe that
Yes.
began to break the story on pedophilia in the archdiocese.
Mm-hmm.
That was around 2001, 2002. So it was really in the thick of the worst media frenzy on this thing that I made the decision to become Catholic. And of course, I was profoundly disturbed by the revelations about the bad behavior of priests. But I have to say, honestly, it didn't stop me from becoming Catholic. And the reason it didn't stop me becoming Catholic is, first of all, I expect the Catholic Church to be filled with corruption and greed and lust and avarice and sins of every kind, because it happens to be filled with human beings. And I've often said on this show that if you found a country that was 100% Catholic, by definition, all the criminals in that country would be Catholic. Right, so there's not a vice you could find in any kind of modern state that wouldn't have been perpetrated by a Catholic someplace, given that everyone is Catholic to a certain extent in that particular culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I was conscious for myself that my decision to become Catholic was not motivated because I wanted to be in fellowship, say, with Cardinal Law of Boston particularly, but because I wanted to be in fellowship with Jesus Christ, who founded the Catholic Church, with the sacraments that he established as its source and summit, with the saints that had lived the Catholic faith so generously and so admirably, and I wanted to go to church with St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Francis of Assisi and St. Thomas Aquinas, and I could leave off some pedophile priests in Boston. Thank you very much, right?
Yeah.
So that's the way I personally handled it, and the problem of bad behavior among clergy and laity, for that matter, I might add. It has not gone away entirely, and it will never go away entirely. Now, what has changed, I think, in the Catholic Church is that, our consciousness about the problem is greatly heightened. And I personally think that probably the Catholic Church in North America has about as vigorous a regime to protect children of any institution you're going to find.
Now.
I mean, it didn't used to, but it does now. And I can tell you that the priests and bishops are running scared on this one, right? I mean, I have a lot of priest friends that are not from this country, and they come over here and work as extern priests from other dioceses around the world. And I've asked some of them, I said, what's the big difference between being a priest here and being a priest where you're from? And they say, well, here we're not allowed to touch anyone. Meaning, like, I can't hug them. I'm even uncomfortable shaking their hand. I mean, like, one of my mentors in the Catholic faith was a 101-year-old blind, cancerous Dominican priest. I mean, he couldn't get out of a chair without help, and he had no eyesight. Right? I mean, 101 years old, but wonderful guy. And I asked him one time. He was he lived in a local religious community, and he barely ever left his room. He had to have assistance to get out of the room. And I asked him if he'd hear my son's confession. My son was a teenage boy at the time, and he was like, well, I don't know. I'm not supposed to be alone in a room with a teenager. And I'm like, you're blind and you can't move. He's like, yeah, but your rules are rules, I mean, so there is definitely a consciousness about this. And I mean, I used to work for the Catholic diocese in my hometown, and at least during my tenure, I was there for about 8 years. One of my jobs was overseeing the youth protection regime in the diocese, and so I was kind of made aware of whenever there were issues or problems. And at least during the time I was there, any issue or problem that got brought up, honestly, never affected. It had nothing to do with any priests, right? It was usually lay people, and it was normally a matter of boundary violations, not necessarily outright abuse. It'd be like, somebody that said something they shouldn't say, or, they made some kind of poor judgment where you go, okay, this is kind of a fishy thing, and we're going to have to clamp down. Maybe that person shouldn't be around anymore. But I didn't see any sexual abuse of kids by clergy, and I saw the clergy, by and large, at least particularly concerning themselves, compliant with the regime in terms of the protection of kids. I also want to put the thing in perspective. As horrible as the abuse of children in the Catholic Church is, and I'm not taking anything away from that, I'm not so sure that from a statistical point of view, that it really stands out as worse than what you would find in other social institutions. And so there was a researcher at Hofstra University named Carol Shakeshaft who did a study on the sexual abuse of children in the public school system and concluded that the risks of a child being sexually abused in one particular state's public school system was vastly higher than the odds that they would be abused in the Catholic Church. Now, that doesn't make the abuse of children in the Catholic Church any more excusable, but it puts it in a social context. You know, people who are abusive often seek out positions of power and influence where they can get access to kids. And so I used to work for back before I was Catholic, I worked for a fundamentalist children's camp in upstate New York. And we got this was, back in the early 90s, and culture's changed a lot since then, but we got kind of a brief pep talk at the beginning of the camp every year on, if you have any kind of strange inclinations, please bow out now because we don't want to have to make any more phone calls to parents.
Yeah.
And found out that, the institution had made a lot of phone calls to parents. And, back in those days, it was like, oh, we're so sorry this happened. Now, today it would be like, we're going to sue the pants off of you and everybody's going to go to the jail. So culture's changed. But, this is we now know from the Southern Baptist Convention and other Protestant groups as well, the Boy Scouts of America, that wherever you have kids, wherever you have adults, wherever you have volunteers, you have to have vigilance about this, and society is just grown in its awareness of the nature of the problem. My my dad, who was born in 1938, had an instance where somebody made an attempt to abuse him when he was about 10 or 12 years old. And back in those days, he and his buddies had absolutely no idea what to do about that. Do you go to parents? Do you go to teachers? They'd never heard of such a thing. They didn't know what to do. So these were good old country boys from Northport, Alabama. So they did what good old country boys from Northport, Alabama would do. They went back to their gun cabinets and loaded up with shotguns and rifles and pistols and hunting knives, and they set out this posse of 12-year-olds out to go get vengeance, but the guy never showed up. So fortunately, murder was avoided.
Wow.
But it's not a new problem in human society. And there was nothing Catholic about these guys,
Sure. Bonnie, is that helpful for you?
No. In other words, sex trafficking is part of being Catholic.
No. Sex trafficking is part of being human. Sex trafficking is part of being human. And the Catholic Church has taken tremendous steps to prevent the sexual abuse of children within the institution of the Catholic Church. Do I think there will ever be a time when I could say with certainty there are no Catholics that are sexual abusers? Probably not, because I couldn't say that about public schools or about human society in any domain.
Bonnie, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Glad you're with us for Call to Communion on this Monday afternoon here on EWTN. Let's go to Bart now, a first-time caller in Illinois, listening on the great Covenant Network. Hey, Bart, what's on your mind today?
Yes, I'd like to ask how is it possible for us to try to minister to people with mental illnesses? Because a lot of these people with bipolar schizophrenic don't want anything to do with the Lord, or they reject His love. And I deal with a lot of those people in my ministry field because I'm always coming across people with mental illnesses, and you try to talk to them and minister to them, they don't want anything to do with the Lord or the Lord's ways of living.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So, there's a lot of ways to minister to people, and evangelizing them or instructing them in Christian doctrine is one way to do it, but there are a lot of other ways. I mean, the Catholic Church recognizes several works of mercy, both spiritual and corporal, and you can minister to a person without ever addressing the spiritual issue at all if you restrict yourself to the corporal works of mercy, for one. So, feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and giving drink to the thirsty and sheltering the homeless and visiting the sick and the imprisoned, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of things are things you can do. Comforting the afflicted is a spiritual work of mercy that you can definitely undertake for someone who has mental illness without challenging their delusions in any way or attempting to evangelize them. People with mental illnesses can be instructed in techniques that can help lessen their distress to a certain extent. You could maybe direct them to the proper therapy or medications. There's all kinds of ways you can help and assist people with mental illness without pushing their buttons, as it were, about Christianity. And when people have psychotic disorders like bipolar type 1, when they get into the manic phase, or schizophrenia, it's kind of by definition they have irrational ideas and delusions that other people around them recognize as delusional. But the people that are in that state don't think they're delusional. They think that it's everybody else in the world that's crazy. And in my anecdotal experience and those that I've talked to, people in that domain typically fall into one of two extremes when it comes to religion. Either, they think they're Jesus Christ, or that they hear from angels, or that, or they're on a mission from God, or whatever it might be. They either have, sort of, grandiose religious delusions, or they go the other way and they have a kind of a horrible paranoia about religion and religious institutions, religious ideas, and think that religious people are out to get them. And, as you know, if you work with this population, it is impossible to proceed with these people by directly challenging their delusions. That all that does is feed the conspiracy and make them think that you're on the other side of whatever dividing line they've drawn down the human race. So you kind of have to kind of play the game and get in the world that they've painted and show a great deal of empathy without directly challenging them, and that's just part of the delusion. And but if you take them, I'll give you an example that I learned from the psychiatrist David Burns, who tells a story in his practice about a fellow came in and he's wanted to tell Burns that he had met with John the Baptist on the way to the doctor's office that day, and Burns is like, okay, I see we have to adjust your medication, and but he had a colleague who was with him who overheard the conversation and turned to the fellow and said, wow, if I got a message from John the Baptist, I'd be really interested to hear what he had to say, And he didn't affirm the guy's delusions, but he approached the fellow with empathy, and so the guy, talked freely about what he alleged to have learned from John the Baptist, and he turned and looked to Burns when he left, and he said, you've had a lot of assistants that were okay, but this guy's really fantastic, and he built a bridge of empathy because he gave the fellow an empathetic ear and loved on him and let him share his concerns from his point of view without ever directly affirming the delusion, and built a bridge of trust that became a bridge to therapeutic healing later down the road.
Bart, what a great question, and thank you so much for your call today from Illinois. In a moment, we'll talk with Chris, who is in Lubbock, Texas, also Ed in Houston. We'll get to a text from Ezekiel and a question from Joe watching us on YouTube. Still time for your phone calls at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Monday afternoon here on EWTN. Do stay with us.
The most original Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
Hello, Journey Home family. Next time, we'll welcome Jennifer Bryson, a former Lutheran and evangelical, to share what led her home to the Catholic Church. Share the journey next time on EWTN's The Journey Home.
The Journey Home, tonight, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and television.
How many times have you heard someone talk about how important it is to be progressive? Have you ever asked them what they mean by that? G.K. Chesterton says, progress is a useless word, for progress takes for granted an already defined direction, and it's exactly about the direction that we disagree. We can't have progress until we've stated what our goal is. Then we can determine whether or not we're moving closer to it or farther from it. The real question is not whether we are progressive, but what is our goal? My goal is to get to heaven and to help others get there too. What's yours?
Spend more time with the Apostle of Common Sense. Visit chesterton.org for more information and go to EWTNRC.com to discover more books and programs written and inspired by G.K. Chesterton.
The free ebook, The Christmas Novena, guides you through the Christmas Novena so you will be ready for Jesus on Christmas Day. It's available at EWTN.com/St. Andrew.
I'm Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. Join me for Beacon of Truth today at 4 p.m. Eastern.
On the next Beacon of Truth, Christ's presence in us and Soulful Psalm 102.
Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
So what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Well, let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Still time for your call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We'll get back to the phones in a second. Quick question here from Joe watching us on YouTube today, David. Joe says, what is the best argument in dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses individuals?
Yeah, thank you. So, Well, the best approach, in my judgment, is to offer them milk and cookies.
A better word than argument, huh?
Right. The best approach is to show them loving kindness. The best argument, if I were forced into the position of having to take a polemical stance against Jehovah's Witnesses, I would ask them how they know the content of the Christian faith, and how they know that they have the right criterion to answer that question, because the presumption of the Jehovah's Witness explicitly is that the 66 books of the Protestant canon of the Bible are the Church's rule of faith, and implicitly as interpreted by the Watchtower Society. And so I would ask, how do you know that the 66-book canon of the Bible is the rule of faith that God intends for the Church? And secondly, how do you know that the Watchtower Society is a reliable interpreter? And I don't think they're used to engaging that question. I think they're quite used to engaging in kind of tit-for-tat exegetical arguments about specific texts of the Bible.
Like, let's get right down into it.
Yeah, like, what does the Bible say about this? What does the Bible say about that?
Yeah.
I'd rather get underneath the presumption, which is that the way to solve theological conflicts is to appeal to the text of the Bible, because I personally don't think that's the way you do it. And while I may have my own opinions about what the Bible teaches or doesn't teach, fundamentally, I don't think the Bible exists to serve that function, right? I mean, any more than I think we could settle debates of Christian doctrine. I mean, this is a little bit extreme, but by appealing to the Betty Crocker Cookbook. Like, the Betty Crocker Cookbook does not exist to solve disputes about Christian doctrine. I don't think the Christian Bible exists to solve those disputes any more than the Betty Crocker Cookbook does. And it's more relevant to those disputes.
Yeah.
But its fundamental purpose for existence is not to solve doctrinal disputes among Christians. And that's what they think, and that's what I think needs to be challenged. Now, for those of you that may be tuning in for the first time and they're saying, did you just compare the Bible to the Betty Crocker Cookbook? Anders? What on earth do you think, right? Well, what I think is witnessed to by the Bible, and that is that to solve questions of Christian identity or doctrine, Christ did not, in fact, point us to the Bible, but he pointed us to the teaching church that he established, to whom he promised, whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven, and whoever hears you hears me, and go into all nations and make disciples and teach them to obey everything that I have commanded. So if you want to know what Christian doctrine is, you must advert to the authority that Christ established, which is the teaching church. Now, where does the Bible play a role in there? So, again, to draw an analogy, a friend of mine, a Lutheran pastor, very kindly just sent me a copy of the Lutheran Service Book. It's a book of Lutheran hymns, which I very much appreciate, by the way. If you happen to be listening, bud, you know who you are. And the Lutheran Service Book plays a role in Lutheran life, a very important one, right? Or maybe a better example would be the Methodist hymn book with all those magnificent hymns by Charles Wesley, right? It's a very important part of the Methodist tradition, and it really does help, guides their thinking and their praying and their theologizing. But it doesn't exist to solve their theological conundrum. It expresses their theology. It's a context for living it and expressing it and singing it and imbibing it and being edified by it. And the Bible's similar in the Catholic life. It's a source of theological reflection and prayer and edification, and it's divinely inspired and it's authoritative. It's just not the rule of faith for the church.
Well, there you go. And we hope that's helpful for you, Joe. Thanks for watching us this afternoon on YouTube. By the way, before we go on to that call, I do want to put in a quick plug for our EWTN YouTube presence. We have expanded it. We have enhanced it. It is a groovy thing, as the Fifth Dimension would say. Do check it out. Go to EWTN's YouTube presence. Just, type in YouTube and then EWTN, and you will see what we're talking about. There's different platforms, the radio platform, the news platform. There's a lot of great content all right there just for you on YouTube. It's our new EWTN presence there. All right, back to the phones right now. Here is Chris in Lubbock, Texas, listening on YouTube as well. Hey, Chris, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I have a friend, she's a college student, and she wants to become Catholic, and she believes in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. Her non-Catholic parents are totally against it. And she is not entering the church this year, but she wants to in the future, and she needs our prayers. But she's also engaging in argument back to the parents, and I would like some advice on how to advise her in this situation, because her number one objection to this whole thing is like, I depend on them for room and board, and et cetera, and I can't do something like enter the Catholic Church because it'll completely upset them, and they, it could make things extremely worse than they are now.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. This is not an unusual problem, and we hear it all the time. A lot of times it's between spouses. Every once in a while it's been parents and children. Of course, I have to point out that Jesus Christ predicted this. He says, I have come not to bring peace but a sword, and, to turn father against child, and, child against father, and husband against wife, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty stark words from the Son of God, who anticipated that the Christian faith would be a source, potentially, of division, even in families. So it's not unusual, and it's been going on a long time, and to a certain extent it happened to me. I lost friends over becoming Catholic and upset some family members as well, so I'm deeply familiar with it, and it's common around here. And so, a person who becomes Catholic at the end of the day does so because they're following conscience. And you just can't live in disobedience to conscience forever. I mean, you can, but you'll be a pretty miserable person if you do. So, ultimately you need to resolve that in the direction of conscience. Now, what I've come to believe is that an effective way of presenting this dilemma to one's non-Catholic relatives, particularly if they're Protestants, if they're practicing Protestant Christians, is to point them to the example of Martin Luther, their own stated hero, right? Who allegedly got up at the Diet of Worms, and he said, "My conscience is held captive to the Word of God. To disobey conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand; I can do no other." And while I think that Luther was wrong in a great deal of many things that he said, I think when he appealed to the primacy of conscience, he actually made a very Catholic claim. And the Catholic Church teaches that one has an absolute duty to conscience, even erroneous conscience. And so I would, I might put the question: Do you think Luther did the right thing to obey his conscience?
Yeah.
Would you ask me to disobey my conscience? And my guess is they're gonna back down from affirming that. But what they'll say is, well, we think you've been brainwashed. We think you ought to take your time, and you ought to go talk to our pastor, and blah 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 blah. They're probably not going to say just straight up disobey your conscience. They're going to feel like, well, this isn't really conscience. This is idiocy on your part. That's typically the kind of response you get. And as a child, if you feel like, 22 years old, I think child, adult, you're kind of bordering on a young adult at that point. But if you feel, you have a duty and honor to your parents, you could, I'm not saying you have to, you could say, okay, I'll talk to your pastor, and I'll talk to your friend, and I'll read your book, and I'll do these things. And if at the end of those processes I still feel persuaded in conscience that this is what I have to do in obedience to God, at that point, would you concede the dignity of my conscience? That's a pretty fair-minded way of handling it, right?
It is.
And then this individual has to go through what actually would be an attempt to brainwash and manipulate her, like the thing that they're going to accuse her of having had happen to her. They will in fact try to do. But if she's respectful about it, and goes through that process and has sort of gotten a pre-commitment, yes, they might not be that reasonable. Maybe they say, no, absolutely not. If you go this way, that means the devil's taken over your brain and a pox on your house, and we're cutting you off. And I hope that's not the case. And at that point, there does come a time when you just have to say, I'm going to follow conscience, come what may. But as Catholics, we shouldn't be afraid of truth. We shouldn't be afraid of dialogue, and we should be respectful to parents, and I often urge people who are in this kind of situation, you should follow your conscience and become Catholic, but you don't have to do it in the most obnoxious way possible. If you're in a situation where you can move forward without polemically engaging your parents, that's best. Just assume they're not going to listen to me, they're not going to be persuaded, so I'm just not going to engage them at that level, right? There's lots of other ways that I can positively engage my parents as a Catholic. And become a better child to them, a better son or daughter than I would otherwise have been. Because of my conscience in the Catholic faith, I'll be better to them. And I won't engage them in the level of theological discussion. But if I'm forced to, I will do it also respectfully and so forth.
Chris, do you think that would be helpful for your friend?
Yes. Is there any, yes, absolutely. If they won't find this on YouTube or on your website, perhaps, and something like something that you've already published that I can point them to reading.
We've got tons and tons and tons of material engaging Catholic and Protestant discussions on theology, and I would direct you to the website calldtocommunion.com and just poke around in there. You'll find all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah.
But that, again, that's for someone who's decided that the way to handle this is to directly engage their parents in theological discussion. And I'm far from convinced that that's the most productive thing for your friend to do at this stage, because maybe it is. You would know better than me where the parents are on all this.
Yeah.
But if they're angry and fearful and paranoid, and they may not be in a mode to have a dispassionate conversation about theology and take your concern seriously. I mean, in my own family life, I have some family members that were very respectful of my Catholic faith and wanted to hear my reasons, and others for whom it didn't matter what the reasons were or how sound they were, it wasn't going to happen. So you have to kind of gauge that on your own.
Chris, thanks so much for your call. If you want to, or if your friend wants to hear the podcast of today's program, Ace will have that posted for you in a couple of hours. Go to EWTN.com/podcasts. That's where you'll find all of our great podcasts on Podcast Central. And you can just scroll down a little bit till you see Call to Communion. Look for today's program. Thanks again for your phone call. It is Call to Communion here on EWTN. Tonight on Catholic Answers Live, Cy Keller takes your phone calls. He'll be talking with apologist Carla Broussard about which Catholic doctrine troubles you. Should be a fascinating program tonight, 6 p.m. Eastern Time, only on EWTN, the exclusive radio home for Catholic Answers Live. Let's go to Houston now and talk with Ed, listening to us on YouTube this afternoon. Hello, Ed. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hi, Tom and Dr. Anders. I have a Presbyterian friend who's about to drop out of OCIA over the doctrine of mortal sin. He wrote to me, "The Scripture is somewhat ambiguous about how one is saved or how one avoids being damned. Judging when an action or thought crosses the line into a grave sin seems subjective. For example, when does admiration cross over into envy or self-confidence into pride? Because there's so much teeth to the mortal sins doctrine, jaws of hell, I see legalism as an inevitable consequence. I imagine a lot of attention would be paid to the technicalities of what constitutes a mortal sin, with a focus on making one's confessions as frequent and comprehensive as possible. I have trouble seeing why I would adopt this. I think I'm happy remaining a Protestant. Can you help me understand his perspective and help me formulate a response?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. First of all, I really wish your friend would call me. I would love to have a conversation with him. So let's encourage him to call me and maybe spend some time on the Call to Communion website too. Secondly, here's one of his motivating concerns. He seems to think that unless he has a solid objective criterion by which he can infallibly identify the presence or absence of mortal sin in his life, that he is necessarily condemned to scrupulosity in consequence. I think that proceeds from a false premise and a false epistemology and a false spirituality that is far more Protestant than it is Catholic, right? Here's what I mean by that. It is a big part of certain forms of Protestantism. And I think you said he was Presbyterian, so certainly certain wings of the Reformed tradition, that I know for sure, that there are things that I must be able to know for sure. I know when I was growing up in the Presbyterian Church, one of the questions that people would often ask is, do you know for sure that you'll go to heaven when you die? Do you know for sure, that there's a God? Do you know for sure that the Bible's the Word of God? But especially, do you know for sure that you'll go to heaven when you die? And it's so baked into the psychology that you just can't imagine what it would be like psychologically to live with the uncertainty of not knowing for sure. And it becomes, that thought is absolutely just intolerable to you, right? Psychologically intolerable. Now, the desire for certainty, for absolute knowledge of every relevant issue, is what drives certain forms of extremism, right? I mean, so like to take the sort of the case of fundamentalism, for example, the fundamentalist is so eager to have a sure and certain norm by which to evaluate the meaning of his life that he will deny, just completely throw out empirical or scientific evidence that contradicts his myth or narrative, because he can't deal with the existential trauma of saying, well, maybe my worldview is incorrect. So I'm just going to assert by fiat that I've got the truth, and therefore I know I've got the truth, right? And the same thing goes with the fiction that, you know, I know for sure I'm going to go to heaven when I die. I take great comfort in that if I'm an evangelical Protestant. And so if, you know, I don't allow the possibility of entertaining any defeaters to that notion. If I have whatever subjective criterion that I can assert, by this I know I'm going to go to heaven when I die, and then if something kind of challenges that, then I just put my fingers in my ears and close my eyes and stamp my feet and go, you know, nah, you know, I'm not going to listen to that. I'm not going to listen to that. That's the devil. That's the devil. That's the devil. I know I was saved. I know I'm saved. I know I was saved, like the little engine that could. Now, you tell me that's not the path to neuroticism, right? But there is no other way to attain that level of introspective certainty, whether about mortal sin or the life of heaven or anything else, except by a kind of like willful decision to not to admit challenges to that belief into one's ideology or worldview, right? And so it's that rather than the Catholic view of reality, I think, that creates the neuroticism and the anxiety that this person is trying to avoid. Now, once you just bite the bullet and say, there are some things I cannot know, and I'm going to be okay with that, my experience is that far from creating anxiety and neuroticism, that opens the floodgates of rationality and peace, right? Because it enables me to confront reality with open eyes and to take evidence as evidence and not to shut my eyes and to deny
Sure.
it. You know, in the moral domain specifically. So first of all, let's talk about mortal sin. It is entirely false that mortal sin is just entirely subjective. That's not true, right? The first criterion of a mortal sin is that an act must be objectively grave. Well, here are some things that are objectively gravely wrong: murder, adultery, theft, bearing false witness, defrauding and lying, not honoring your father and your mother, euthanasia, direct abortion, direct sterilization. The Catechism lists several. St. Paul in Galatians 5 lists several, fornication, adultery, factions, jealousy, hatred of parents, disobedience, blah, 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 blah. I mean, there are things that are objectively wrong. It's not hard for me to know that you shouldn't commit genocide, okay? It's not hard. I mean, yes, that's objectively gravely wrong. The second criteria is that you need to know that it's gravely wrong, okay? I know those things are gravely wrong. All right. If we're having this conversation, you know it too.
Sure,
right?
Of course.
The final one is that it has to be done with the free consent of my will. All right. And that's where the subjective comes in a little bit. How much am I influenced by culture? How much by my biology? There may be other factors that can muddy the waters. And so rather than like having the situation of like going, oh my gosh, I tripped over my neighbor's cat. Maybe that's a mortal sin. That's a scrupulous person. That's not the situation that we would envision. We'd see rather somebody who maybe does something that is objectively gravely wrong, like commits murder, but they've grown up, say in a vendetta culture of early modern Italy, or maybe, some kind of, a traditional tribal society where there's no legal system. And then, as third-party observers, we might step back and go, well, we can't really say, like, given that person's cultural background and the limits of their perspective, perhaps that's not mortal in that individual's case, right? Because they know no other way to be in the world, right? What I have found about Catholic life is that I am less neurotic and more free in my thoughts and actions as a Catholic than I was as a Protestant. But again, as far as the objective gravity of acts is concerned, it's not hard. Now, some of his confusion is terminological there. So there is no case where self-esteem bleeds into pride. That's a category mistake. That was one of the instances that you gave.
Yeah.
Self-esteem is not a sin. Pride is, right? They don't mean the same thing. They're not analogous. They're two different things, right? Pride is a desire for an immoderate, an unwarranted and unmerited praise or valuing in other people's eyes and my own eyes, right? Seeing myself that I am more important than you, or I am better than you, and you should recognize that about me. That's, and really craving that desire. That's pride. Self-esteem would be an honest assessment of, like, I personally am terrible at tennis, but I have a cousin who's really good at tennis. He was a college tennis player and, maybe even possibly could have gone pro. And he could say, I'm good at tennis.
Yeah.
Right? That's not
a pride thing.
That's not a pride thing. That's just he's good at tennis.
Yeah.
Tom Price here sitting across from me has got the best radio voice in the business. Like, he's just amazing with his vocal training. And he's not going to admit it, but he knows he's good. He knows he's good in that lane. That's not pride. Like, that's how the man makes his living. He's just good at it because that's what he does. That's not pride. That's an honest assessment of one's qualities, and one can say that's a compensator in life. And I don't feel like a complete failure in the world because, yes, I can, play chopsticks on the piano or something.
Ed, thanks so much for your call. I want to get to this text from Ezekiel, and I think a lot of people think about things like this. What should we do if AI turns out to be a bad thing for humanity?
Yeah, well, like electricity is a bad thing for humanity when you stick your finger in a socket.
True,
okay?
True.
And I do think there are some ways in which artificial intelligence has been bad for humanity. I mean, one of them is that people who use artificial intelligence engines naively can be deceived. They can be given information that's not complete or that's biased because, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
That's how the algorithm works. I think a real challenge with the use of computer technology is that it can tend to intellectual flabbiness. I know that's true in my own case. I think personally, my intellectual powers were probably at their greatest right when I finished my doctoral dissertation, and I got done before AI, and really even before the internet became a huge thing. I finished in 2003, and we didn't even have good pictures on the internet until after that, And my first engagements with the internet were like, yeah, no big deal. There's not that much there. Now, of course, you can get anything there. So I had to do all my schooling without the benefit of the internet, and I'm really grateful that I did. And now it's like, okay, ChatGPT, what's the answer to this problem? And I don't have the time, and I don't have to do the same kind of level of sustained research that I used to. And I literally feel IQ points draining out of my brain every year that I get one year farther from my doctoral dissertation. But it's not all AI's fault, But I do think it can lead to that kind of intellectual flabbiness, which is why a lot of the professors and teachers are trying to come up with ways to teach that will inoculate kids against that particular danger. Writing in-class essays, this kind of thing, right? And then also, of course, the grave risk of plagiarism that one is not forced to think through one's ideas, and one can just let the AI engine do the work for them. And they're citing uncited sources, and so you're borrowing other people's work without knowing it. And of course, that in the intellectual property theft domain. The artists and the content creators are really upset about this because you don't have to go pay a commissioned artist to create content. You just say, well, tell the AI to create art in the style of so-and-so, and it creates a semi-original composition, but basically is, stealing food from the mouths of content creators. So there are objective problems. And then, of course, also another big one is the possibility that AI could create, fake news stories and that sort of thing and be used for nefarious ends. So all of those things are things to be aware of. Now, I don't think it's a question if they turn out to be the case. They are, in fact, the case, right?
Yeah.
So you're aware of that, and you inoculate yourself against it by selective use of the technology and by really going out of the way to help yourself and those that you love develop a deep education and critical faculties and education about the dangers and how to avoid them. Now, are there benefits to artificial intelligence engines? You bet. I was actually working on a presentation recently in which there's a famous quote from Gregory Nazianzus about the city of Constantinople during the Arian controversy, when every shopkeeper and barrel maker you'd order a new pair of boots, and he'd want to know whether the sun was generated or ungenerated. Because everybody had an opinion on the Christological debates, and his Nazianzus' point was that this is kind of making a mockery out of the Christological debates. It's turned it into something like the World Wrestling Federation of theology. It's like very low bar entertainment. And he's like, this is not how this should be conducted. And you read that quote in secondary sources all the time, and I didn't know the source, and I couldn't read all of Gregory Nazianzus. So I asked an AI engine to find the citation for me. And in about 2 seconds, it pulled it out of the Patrologia Graecae.
Wow.
And I had the reference.
And there it was.
And it saved me, a a doctoral degree in classics to find that.
Ezekiel, thanks so much for your text. We got a call from Rich in Fort Myers, who has a great question. Unfortunately, Rich, we are out of time. Please call us back tomorrow. We'll put you at the head of the line. Dr. David Anders, thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Tom.
Don't forget, we do this program Monday through Friday right here on EWTN at 2 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Check out the podcast by going to EWTN.com/podcasts. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Thank you for joining us. See you tomorrow on the Tuesday edition of Call to Communion. God bless.
Prayer is a variety of forms of communication. Sometimes we simply greet one another, hi, how are you? And we say small, short prayers similarly to God. Other times